In 1961, a 55-year-old political philosopher boarded a plane to Jerusalem to cover a trial for The New Yorker. The man on trial was Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi SS officer who had been one of the primary administrators of the Holocaust, responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of Jews to the extermination camps. He had been captured in Argentina by Israeli agents and brought to Jerusalem to face justice.
The philosopher expected a monster. What she found was something she described as terrifyingly normal. A bureaucrat. A man who spoke in clichés, who was proud of his efficiency, who kept insisting that he had done his duty, followed orders, never acted out of personal malice. A man who, in her assessment, was not evil in the way we usually imagine evil, not sadistic, not ideologically consumed, not driven by demonic will. He was thoughtless, shallowly, bureaucratically, catastrophically thoughtless.
Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Claire.
And I'm Shawn. The philosopher was Hannah Arendt, and the phrase she coined to describe what she saw, the banality of evil, became one of the most debated and most important ideas in 20th-century political philosophy. Today we are talking about Arendt, who she was, what she argued, why the banality of evil is both more specific and more disturbing than the popular shorthand suggests, and what her broader political philosophy has to say to anyone thinking seriously about power, authority, and what it means to live in a political world. Big ideas, human conversations. Let's go. Hannah Arendt was born in Hanover, Germany, into a secular Jewish family. She was intellectually precocious. She read Kant at 14, studied theology and Greek as an adolescent, and arrived at the University of Marburg at 18 to study philosophy. Her first teacher there was Martin Heidegger, who was at that moment the most exciting philosopher in Germany and arguably in Europe. She also had an affair with him that lasted on and off for years, and that she never fully renounced, despite Heidegger's later membership in the Nazi Party, a fact that was a source of controversy and pain throughout her life.
She went on to study with Karl Jaspers in Heidelberg, who became a more durable intellectual and personal influence. Her doctoral dissertation was on the concept of love in Augustine. She was working on a study of German Romanticism when Hitler came to power in 1933. She was arrested briefly by the Gestapo, released, and left Germany, eventually making her way to Paris, where she worked with Zionist organizations helping Jewish refugees emigrate to Palestine. When France fell in 1940, she was interned in a camp at Gurs. She escaped, made her way to the United States in 1941, and spent the rest of her life in New York.
Her experience of statelessness, of being a person without a country, without legal protection, dependent entirely on the goodwill of others, shaped her thinking in fundamental ways. Her first major book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, published in 1951, was in part an attempt to understand how the world she had grown up in had produced the catastrophes of Nazism and Stalinism. It is a long and dense work, combining history, sociology, and political theory in ways that made it difficult to categorize and easy to underestimate. It remains one of the most important political books of the 20th century.
Her second major work was The Human Condition, published in 1958, which is probably her most systematic philosophical contribution, an analysis of the vita activa, the active life, organized around a three-part distinction between labor, work, and action that I want to come back to. And then, the Eichmann book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, subtitled A Report on the Banality of Evil, published in 1963, which generated more controversy than anything else she wrote and which secured her permanent place in the intellectual history of the 20th century.
Arendt was not a conventional academic philosopher. She did not produce a systematic philosophical system in the manner of Kant or Hegel. She was a political thinker in the broadest sense, someone who thought about politics, history, power, and human action with philosophical rigor and literary seriousness. She wrote in German and English, read Latin and Greek, and drew on the full range of Western intellectual tradition, ancient and modern, philosophical and literary, in a way that was unusual and that made her work resistant to easy disciplinary categorization. She was, simply, one of the most important thinkers of her century. The question of her relationship with Heidegger deserves a bit more attention because it is genuinely complicated and because it touches on something important about how we relate to the work of thinkers whose personal lives and political choices were seriously wrong. Heidegger was not merely sympathetic to National Socialism. He was an active member of the Nazi Party, and as rector of Freiburg University implemented policies of racial discrimination. He never fully recanted or apologized. And yet, he was also one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century, whose work on being in time, transformed how philosophy thought about human existence, time, and care.
Arendt spent years thinking about how to hold both of those facts. She did not dismiss his philosophy because of his politics. She did not dismiss his politics because of his philosophy. She tried imperfectly and not always successfully to think about both honestly. And her eventual conclusion was something like his political failure was connected to his philosophical limitations, specifically to his failure to think politically. His inability to understand the world of human plurality and action that she placed at the center of her own work. Heidegger was a great thinker who could not think politically, and that, for Arendt, was itself a philosophical problem.
That inability to think politically stands in contrast to Arendt's emphasis on plurality and action themes she would develop throughout her work, especially in response to the catastrophes of the 20th century.
The origins of totalitarianism is not primarily about how totalitarianism arose historically, though it covers that. It is about what totalitarianism is, what kind of thing it is, what makes it genuinely new in the history of political forms, why it cannot be understood simply as a particularly extreme version of tyranny or dictatorship.
Arendt's central claim is that totalitarianism, as it appeared in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, was something genuinely unprecedented. Not just unusually brutal, not just efficiently repressive, but organized around a principle that had no precedent in the history of government: the attempt to transform human nature itself. Previous tyrannies had wanted to monopolize power, to silence opposition, to exploit populations. Totalitarianism wanted something more radical: to produce a new kind of human being, fully subsumed into the movement, stripped of individuality, incapable of independent thought or action.
The concentration camp, for Arendt, was the most extreme expression of this project. It was not primarily an instrument of punishment or even of terror, though it was both. It was an experiment in human transformation, an attempt to demonstrate that human beings could be so completely dehumanized that they became, in her phrase, superfluous. Not just politically neutralized, but ontologically destroyed, stripped of the qualities that make a person, the capacity to act, to think, to relate to others as individuals.
The ideological dimension of totalitarianism is equally important in Arendt's analysis. Both Nazism and Stalinism were organized around a total ideology, a comprehensive explanation of history and society that claimed to have identified the laws governing human affairs and that justified any action taken in service of those laws. For the Nazis, the law was the law of nature, the struggle for racial supremacy. For Stalin, it was the law of history, the dialectic of class struggle. In both cases, the ideology transformed politics from a domain of judgment and deliberation into a domain of administration, the management of a historical process that was already determined. And the ideology provided a framework in which mass murder could be understood not as crime, but as necessity.
What Arendt draws from this analysis is a set of warnings about conditions that make totalitarianism possible, conditions that she believed were not unique to Germany or Russia, but present wherever political life broke down. The atomization of individuals, the destruction of intermediate associations, communities, and traditions that give people a sense of belonging and orientation. The rise of loneliness as a mass political phenomenon, not private sadness, but the political experience of having no place in the world, no relationships of genuine solidarity, nothing to anchor identity. And the susceptibility to ideological thinking that comes from that loneliness, the appeal of a total explanation that tells the isolated, disoriented person exactly who they are and who the enemy is.
The book was published in 1951, when the Cold War was just beginning, and when the full horror of both Nazi and Stalinist atrocities was still being absorbed. It was immediately recognized as a major work, and it has become more rather than less relevant in the decades since, as the conditions Arendt described: atomization, loneliness, ideological susceptibility, the erosion of democratic institutions have periodically reasserted themselves in new forms. One passage from Origins that I think has particular contemporary resonance is her analysis of the relationship between loneliness and totalitarian susceptibility. She distinguishes between solitude, being alone with oneself in a productive way, the condition in which thinking happens, and loneliness, the experience of being abandoned by the human world, of having no place in it, of feeling that one's existence is superfluous. Loneliness, she argues, is the common ground of terror. People who feel that they do not matter, that they have no stable place in the world, that their individual existence is of no significance, are peculiarly susceptible to movements that offer them identity, community, and an enemy to blame.
She was writing in 1951 about the conditions that produced Nazism and Stalinism. But the analysis maps onto patterns that reappear whenever economic and social disruption destroys the intermediate institutions, the churches, the unions, the local communities, the professional associations that give people a sense of belonging and orientation. When those structures collapse, people are left isolated and adrift in a way that makes ideological movements with simple explanations and strong group identities intensely appealing. Arendt does not provide a recipe for preventing this. But she insists that recognizing it, understanding what political atomization actually does to people and to their capacity for independent judgment, is the beginning of any serious political response. The Eichmann trial and Arendt's report on it is where I want to spend the most time, because I think the banality of evil is both the most important and the most misunderstood concept in Arendt's work. The misunderstanding is almost always in the direction of making it too simple.
The popular shorthand is, evil is banal because ordinary people can do terrible things. And that is true and important. But it is not what Arendt was primarily arguing. She was making a more specific and philosophically precise claim about Eichmann himself, about the particular character of his participation in the Holocaust, and what it revealed about a specific kind of evil.
Arendt's observation was that Eichmann was not driven by ideology in the way the prosecution assumed. He was not a committed anti-Semite who hated Jews and wanted them destroyed. He was, in her account, a man who was essentially thoughtless, not stupid, but incapable of the kind of independent moral thinking that would have required him to step back from his role and ask, what am I actually doing, and what does it mean? He followed orders. He was proud of his efficiency. He used bureaucratic clichés to describe everything he did. He seemed genuinely unable to think from the standpoint of anyone other than himself and his career.
The phrase she coined, the banality of evil, was meant to capture this specific failure. Evil, she was arguing, does not always arise from demonic will, or ideological fervor, or sadistic pleasure. It can arise from the absence of thought, from the failure, the refusal, or the incapacity to think about what you are doing from a moral standpoint. And that kind of evil is, in a specific sense, banal, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of thing that can happen wherever people stop thinking and simply execute their role.
The reaction to this argument was explosive and often deeply unfair. Many readers interpreted Arendt as saying that Eichmann was not really responsible for his actions, that he was just following orders, that his thoughtlessness exculpated him. She argued the precise opposite. He was responsible. The fact that he did not think did not absolve him, it condemned him. Thoughtlessness, in her framework, is not an excuse. It is the moral failure itself. The inability or refusal to think to apply your moral imagination to what you are doing is what makes a person capable of participating in atrocity without recognizing it as atrocity.
Others objected that Arendt had underestimated the ideological dimension of Eichmann's participation, that subsequent historical research suggested he was more committed to Nazi anti-Semitism than her account allowed. The historian Deborah Lipstadt argued this forcefully, and the debate has continued. But even granting that Eichmann was more ideologically motivated than Arendt believed, the broader philosophical claim about thoughtlessness as a source of evil retains its force. Ideological possession is itself a form of the failure to think a substitution of the movement's categories for independent moral judgment.
The connection to our earlier episodes is worth making explicit. Anna Freud described the mechanisms by which the mind protects itself from uncomfortable truths. Jung described the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Arendt is describing a political version of the same phenomenon, the capacity of human beings to participate in systematic evil by not thinking, by refusing the kind of moral imagination that would force them to confront what they are actually doing. The defense mechanisms operate at the individual level. The banality of evil describes how they operate at the institutional and political level.
I want to add one more dimension to the banality of evil argument that I think is crucial and that often gets lost. Arendt is not just making a claim about Eichmann. She is making a claim about the conditions of moral thinking generally, about what thinking from a moral standpoint actually requires and how difficult it is. She argues that moral thinking requires the capacity to imagine oneself in the position of others, what she calls the representative thinking, that is essential to both political judgment and moral judgment. Eichmann could not do this. He could not think from the standpoint of his victims. And this incapacity, not wickedness, not ideology, but the inability to extend moral imagination beyond the boundaries of his own role and his own career, is what she identifies as the specific character of his failure.
Which means that the banality of evil is not a comfortable idea, however much it has been popularized. It does not let the rest of us off the hook by saying that only unusual people do terrible things. It asks, how much do we extend our moral imagination beyond our own immediate interests and roles? How much do we think from the standpoint of those affected by what we do? The gap between Eichmann's failure and the ordinary human tendency to stay within comfortable boundaries of concern is smaller than we would like it to be. That is the genuinely unsettling implication of the argument.
It's a challenge to everyone to examine whether we are truly thinking or simply complying with what our roles require of us, without considering the broader consequences for others. I want to turn now to Arendt's positive political philosophy, to what she thought politics at its best could be, because I think it is as important as her analysis of what politics at its worst looks like. And the two are deeply connected.
In the human condition, Arendt distinguishes between three kinds of human activity. Labor is the activity that sustains biological life, the endless cycle of production and consumption that keeps us alive. Work is the activity that produces the durable human world, the objects, institutions, and artifacts that outlast individual human lives and provide a common world for human beings to inhabit. And action is the distinctively human activity, the activity of appearing in public among equals, of speaking and acting in ways that disclose who you are and that contribute to the ongoing human story.
Action, for Arendt, is the highest form of the vita activa, and it is irreducibly political. To act, in her sense, is not just to do something, it is to begin something new, to insert yourself into the human world in a way that has effects you cannot fully predict or control. Every genuine action is a kind of miracle, in the sense that it introduces something new into the world that was not determined by what came before. The capacity for action, what she calls natality, the fact that we are born beginners, each of us capable of starting something new, is what gives political life its dignity and its hope.
Power, in Arendt's framework, is not what most people mean by power. She is not talking about the ability to dominate or coerce. Power, for Arendt, is what comes into being when people act together, when they concert their wills and their actions around a shared purpose. It is inherently collective and inherently dependent on ongoing agreement. The moment people stop consenting and acting together, the power evaporates. This is why she says that power and violence are opposites, not synonyms.
Violence, in her account, is what is used when power has failed, when a government can no longer command genuine consent and must substitute force. A government that relies primarily on violence is one whose power is already in decline. The most powerful governments are the ones that need the least violence, because their authority rests on genuine agreement, on the consent and active participation of the people they govern. Tyranny is weak in this deeper sense, even when it appears externally strong, because it has destroyed the conditions for genuine collective action.
This analysis has significant implications for how we think about political legitimacy and political decay. Arendt would say that a political system that is increasingly reliant on spectacle, on fear, on the manipulation of information rather than on genuine deliberation and consent is a system whose power is draining away even as its coercive apparatus grows. The surface can look strong, the foundation is hollowing out. And the moment the consent evaporates completely, the moment enough people stop playing along, the violence that remains is exposed as the brittle substitute it always was.
Her analysis of the public realm is equally important. Arendt believed that genuine politics requires a public space, a space in which people can appear before each other as equals, can speak and be heard, can act in ways that are visible to others, and that contribute to a shared world. The destruction of the public realm through privatization of political life, through atomization, through the substitution of administration for genuine deliberation, is for Arendt one of the most serious political dangers. When people retreat entirely into private life, when they stop participating in the shared world, the political institutions that depend on that participation begin to decay. The concept of natality is one of Arendt's most distinctive and most hopeful contributions. She uses it to name the fact that each new human being born into the world is a new beginning, a source of genuine novelty, capable of acting in ways that were not predetermined by what came before. Against the totalitarian project of making humanity superfluous, against the deterministic frameworks that treat history as a closed causal system, Arendt insists on the irreducible capacity of human beings to begin something new. Every genuine act of political freedom is an exercise of natality, a refusal to accept that things must remain as they are, an assertion that something new is possible.
This is philosophically significant because it places hope at the center of political life without making it naive. Arendt is not saying that things will get better. She is saying that the capacity to make them better, the capacity for genuine beginnings, is a permanent feature of being human. Totalitarianism tried to destroy it and could not finally succeed. The people who resisted, who protected their neighbors, who refused complicity even at enormous personal cost, were exercising exactly this capacity. And the political world they were living in, however dark, had not entirely destroyed the space for that exercise.
That irreducible hope, grounded in the continual possibility for new beginnings, underpins Arendt's insistence that political action remains meaningful, even amid catastrophe.
The last major theme I want to address is what Arendt called the life of the mind, the idea that thinking itself is a moral and political act, not merely an intellectual exercise. This was the project she was working on when she died in 1975, and the unfinished manuscript was published posthumously as The Life of the Mind.
The connection to the banality of evil is direct. If Eichmann's crime was, at its root, a failure to think, a failure to apply independent moral judgment to what he was doing, then thinking becomes not just a cognitive activity but a moral obligation. The refusal to think, in Arendt's framework, is not a neutral act. It is a form of complicity. And genuine thinking, the kind that requires you to step back from your role and your ideology and ask what you are actually doing and what it means, is a form of moral resistance.
She distinguished between thinking and cognition. Cognition is problem-solving, the application of intelligence to questions that have answers. Thinking is something different, the internal dialogue of the mind with itself, the examination of meaning rather than the production of knowledge. Thinking, in Arendt's sense, is inherently destabilizing. It does not produce certainty, but dissolves it, holding open questions that might have been prematurely closed, refusing the comfort of easy answers. It is, she says, the inner preparation for action, the way a person develops, the kind of independent judgment that cannot be simply commanded by authority.
Socrates is Arendt's model here, and the connection is deliberate. Socrates did not produce philosophical doctrines. He went around asking questions that exposed the contradictions in people's beliefs, that made them uncomfortable with certainties they had not examined. He was, in Arendt's reading, a practitioner of pure thinking, someone who modeled the activity of holding questions open rather than closing them with answers. And the Athenians killed him for it, which tells you something about the political stakes of genuine thinking.
The political dimension of Arendt's account of thinking is this. In conditions of political crisis, in conditions where ideology is powerful and institutions are weak, and the pressure to simply comply with whatever the prevailing system demands is enormous, the capacity for independent thinking is one of the few remaining resources a person has. It cannot change the situation directly, but it creates the internal conditions for refusing complicity. It is the difference between Eichmann, who stopped thinking and participated in atrocity, and the people who, in the same circumstances, found ways to resist, to protect, to refuse.
Arendt's concept of judgment is closely related. Judgment, for her, is the faculty by which we assess particular cases, not by applying a general rule, but by thinking from the standpoint of others, by imagining how a situation would look to someone else, by developing what Kant called enlarged thinking. Good judgment requires the capacity to transcend your own particular standpoint without abandoning it to see things as others see them while still being yourself. And this capacity, she argued, is both rare and essential. It is what is required of anyone who wants to act responsibly in the world rather than simply executing their role.
The connection to our season runs deep. From Anna Freud's defense mechanisms to Jung's shadow to Kahneman's cognitive biases, we have been building a picture of the mind as something that systematically resists clear seeing. Arendt is arguing that the political world makes the same demand as the psychological one, that genuine engagement with reality requires the kind of sustained, uncomfortable, independent thinking that our minds are designed to avoid and that our institutions often actively discourage, and that the failure to do that thinking has consequences that reach far beyond the individual.
There is a short essay Arendt wrote called Thinking and Moral Considerations that I think is one of the most concise and powerful statements of her position. She asks, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining whatever happens to come to pass, or to attract attention, regardless of results and specific content, could this activity be among the conditions that make men abstain from evil doing, or even actually condition them against it? Her answer is a careful yes, not that thinking guarantees goodness, but that the refusal to think is one of the primary conditions for participating in evil without recognizing it as evil. The examined life, in Arendt's political philosophy, is not just personally valuable, it is politically necessary.
And that brings everything together. Socrates, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, de Beauvoir, and now Arendt, around a single thread. The examined life is not a luxury. It is not a hobby for people with too much time. It is the basic requirement for living responsibly in a world where your choices have consequences for others, where institutions can be corrupted, where the temptation to simply comply with whatever the prevailing system demands is constant and powerful. Philosophy is not the only tool for doing that examining, but it is one of the oldest and most developed tools we have. And taking it seriously not as a collection of positions to hold, but as a practice of thinking, is what this show is trying to be about.
It's really the project of the show, to model and encourage the kind of reflective, honest thinking that Arendt believed was crucial to both moral and political life. I want to say something about why Arendt feels so urgent now, not as a historical figure, but as a contemporary one. Because her analysis of the conditions that produce political catastrophe was not a description of a unique historical moment. It was a structural analysis. And the structures she described, the atomization, the loneliness, the susceptibility to ideological thinking, the erosion of genuine public deliberation, the substitution of spectacle for substance, are not conditions that were defeated in 1945 and filed away. They are conditions that require continuous political work to resist.
What I find most important in Arendt is the insistence that politics is not administration, that the management of collective life, the reduction of political questions to technical problems to be solved by experts, is itself a form of political decay. Genuine politics requires genuine deliberation among equals, genuine disagreement taken seriously, genuine public space in which people appear as individuals with distinct perspectives rather than as consumers or subjects. When that space contracts, when people retreat into private life, when institutions lose legitimacy, when the public realm is colonized by spectacle and manipulation, something essential is being lost. And the loss is not inevitable. But recovering it requires the kind of active, thinking, participating citizenship that Arendt believed was both the highest form of human activity and the most fragile.
The banality of evil is the negative image of this picture. If the highest human activity is genuine thinking and genuine political action, then the deepest failure is the surrender of those capacities, the retreat into role, into routine, into the comfortable execution of what the system requires, without asking what the system is doing. Eichmann was an extreme case, but the dynamic he exemplifies, the willingness to stop thinking in exchange for the security of compliance, is available in milder forms in almost every institutional context. And Arendt's work is, among other things, a sustained argument for taking that dynamic seriously long before it reaches anything like its extreme expression.
Next week, Shawn and I are stepping back from individual thinkers and asking the question, what does it mean to live philosophically? Not to hold philosophical positions, but to actually practice philosophy as a way of life, as a daily orientation toward the questions that matter. We will draw on everything we have covered and try to say something honest about what we think it adds up to.
Before we get there, I want to say something about Arendt that I think is easy to miss in the weight of her analysis of catastrophe. She was not a pessimist. She was extraordinarily clear-eyed about what human beings are capable of. At their worst, she had watched it happen in her own lifetime, had been displaced by it, had been shaped permanently by it, and she still believed in politics. Not in the naive sense that it would fix everything, but in the deeper sense that the capacity for genuine political action, for people coming together in public to speak and act and begin something new, was one of the most valuable things human beings possessed. She never stopped believing that it was worth defending.
That combination, unflinching about the worst, committed to the best, seems to me the right spirit to bring to political life and to philosophy. You do not have to pretend that things are better than they are in order to work toward making them better. The examined life, as Arendt understood it, requires both the willingness to see clearly and the willingness to act on what you see. Neither without the other, both together.
If this episode made Arendt feel relevant to the world you are actually living in, share it. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for.
Sources and further reading are in the show notes.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations.
See you next week.